Our next speaker will be joining us from a video link. I'm also very excited to hear from Karen Deegan. Karen is going to be speaking about co-housing project goals and financial pathways, which ties into a question that I was mentioning earlier about decisions around what level of co-housing you have. Obviously, financial constraints are a key indicator of what level of co-housing design you're going to be able to have as a group. And Karen is a managing director. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Karen was a co-founder of Urban Coop, so I imagine she knows Eleanor as well. And she's currently putting together Newcastle Collaborative Housing, otherwise known as NewCo, which is another urban collaborative project in Newcastle. She's also a member of Cohousing Australia and helps other groups with advice and formation of property goals. I will hand over now to Karen of Built for Good.
Hello, everyone. I can't hear you all, so I'm doing this a bit blind, but I can already feel the energy in the room, and I'm really grateful to be invited, and really big thanks to everyone who's pulled this together. It's a fantastic group of speakers. I'm just going to share my screen now to pull up my presentation. So, co-housing and its pathways to finance. I just want to say again, good morning, and I hope you're having a good day so far. And I want to let you all know that I'm presenting today on the lands of the Worimi and Awabakal people, and I pay my respects to all of them living, the ones that have preceded them and the ones emerging. And I really want to make a point we all know that this land was never ceded, and it's something that NewCo grapples with in the terms of how we deal with that going forward around property ownership and property rights. To take a step back, I like to remind everyone why we're here, why we don't buy just a normal home. We all have a dream, and they all are slightly different versions of each other of what co-housing will be once we live in it. But it's really important that we start there, because it is the beginning of why and what we do to create it. Dreams of co-houses basically really revolve around things like good neighbours, people we can share our lives with by just walking out our back door, something that's not easy to find in an Australian context, whether that's in the city or in suburbia. Dreams can be about productive gardens and building that together. How do we grow food like we used to and share it together, and how that brings us together as human beings? Dreams can also be something as sort of simple as bricks and mortar being a multi-purpose room, or the common house as it's called in the co-housing world. These images, especially from Scandinavia, where there's lots of beautiful co-housing projects and beautiful common houses, are really inspiring, and it's really easy to imagine ourselves there sharing meals and pickling vegetables and sewing together and crying together and laughing together. I really love this image because this is one of my dreams, having a really beautiful place to have my bicycle so that we can easily get it in and out. And these are the sorts of things that are different and what can be created when we come together to create co-housing. And then there's also the little things, like little places where we can gather and talk and share our afternoons and spend time together in places that you normally wouldn't sit with your neighbours. But all in all, it's about living in a community. Co-housing is about a place-based community. And I think that when I'm speaking to people who've never heard of co-housing before, this is the really specific thing that sets it apart from other housing models. It's a place where you see each other's laundry, and that you can socialise with your Crocs on. But today's presentation is to put a little bit of a spotlight on the part about why it's so hard. And a big part of why it's so hard is that there are barriers to financing the property development of our projects. And hopefully with this presentation, which is very high level, we are going to describe some of the ways we can break through those barriers based on what has happened in Australia so far. My dream is that co-housing property development finance is going to be easy and welcomed one day, and that it may even come with a free coffee. Who am I? I have already been introduced. I was a part of NewCo, and I'm so congratulatory of the people that are living in it now. They've made it real. And I'm in the process of creating a new one with NewCo. We're just at the part where we hopefully will settle on a piece of land. I just want to make sure that I've got my terminology right. I think I've made this up. What a financial pathway. A financial pathway is basically saying that to create these projects, all co-housing projects in Australia, we have to really understand are innovative. They're new. They're not really well understood by local councils or government, let alone lending entities, banks and other places where you can get money to build a building. So what we're going to cover today is not necessarily exact science, but it's more, if you have a project goal, this is the general pathway to get finance, to get your land purchased and to get the buildings built. This is my beautiful diagram of how I think and what we'll cover in the next set of slides, which is at the beginning, you have your group of co-housing members, and it might not be all of them that will live in it at the end of the day, but at least a core amount. Those people really have to agree the goals of what they want in their co-housing project. And it's really important that they go through a really thorough process of understanding what they want, and they go through a thorough process of all of them deciding that this is why we're here together and this is the goals we're going to stick with, because it's when that happens that they can then ride the bumpy pathway to get to finance. So I'm just going to also touch on what I mean by co-housing group goals, just so that we can be clear what I'm talking about here. What I mean by goals and how they relate to financial pathways, here are some examples. So goals could be that as a co-housing group, you want to live in an intentional community. And those are things that push outcomes like having places that you share your life in, like this beautiful common house in Murrindaka. But a goal could also be that as a collective of people, and what you decide to build and how you live in it could be reducing our collective impact on climate change. So this is also a potential common goal of co-housing groups. Another really important goal that is becoming more and more pertinent every day is affordability. How can we come together to come up with answers to making our homes more affordable to purchase or to rent or other potential mechanism, and how that then allows people to not only live in a community, but also have agency over where they live. There are other beautiful goals that we've seen from projects that have been set up for a long time in other parts of the world, where bringing a mix of generations together really can enhance the way we live. This is probably how we more naturally lived when we were living in tribes, with young people and older generations all together, sharing every day and sharing wisdoms and experience. The other part is that we want to be self-governed. We don't necessarily want a body corporate telling us how to run things, what to upkeep, how to use our space. Being self-governed teaches us how to be very diplomatic when we are working in a group and managing a property together, but it also empowers all of us and everyone living in a co-housing community that they are agents, not just of their own home, but also the grounds around them. Participatory design is also an amazing aspect of co-housing, where together we learn what's possible in a design of a co-housing community, and together we decide. And that through that collective knowledge and wisdom and opinions, we create one huge thing together, a whole project, almost a creative project together. And there's something extremely magical about stepping back after you've co-designed something and seeing that together you all created a single thing that's really big, like a building. And a mix of socio-demographic backgrounds, which is a whole lot of special words for saying that we want to live in a community that's really reflective of the people, of the whole population. We don't want to be segregated into one type of tribe. And so those are the sorts of goals that once you've decided as a group and you're very sure and you're very concrete, they're the ones you want, these are the elements that start to frame the way you can get finance to purchase land and to finance the construction of your buildings. They generally fall into two groups. So the goals can either be related to going down a pathway where you really need to find a partner, you need to find an external partner, and I'll talk to what those sorts of partners can be in another slide. Or there are other goals that really are better facilitated through what I call the do-it-ourselves model. The do-it-ourselves model is kind of like the DIY, but it's a DIO, I like to call it. And in essence, it's not that the goals in the do-it-ourselves model have to be in that, but you'll definitely get more choice and control by doing it under a do-it-ourselves model. And I'll explain what these two are in general. I'll start with the number one, the partnership ones. So if you are after affordability, if you are after affordable rental, affordable purchase, or say like a mix of socio-demographic backgrounds, where you want to bring in, say, people eligible for social housing and community housing, you were really looking to partner with external organisations. And you're not limited to just government. I mean, government, local government, state and federal government are your easy go-to. But there's also affiliated organisations like community housing providers, which are funded by government, but then them and of themselves are not government. And then there's faith organisations, philanthropic organisations, and charitable organisations, which all sound very similar, but in essence, how they would look at a project and whether they would choose to fund a project, they are slightly different, and they need to be understood to be able to approach them with an idea. I'm going to just use the really famous project that I hope we all know here, the Murrindaka co-housing community in Victoria, to show how some of their goals led to, or maybe became a part of, why they chose to, in a way, partner with external organisations. Their goals were many and wonderful. They were very keen on sustainability, that it was pedestrian focused, so that the cars were on the periphery, that it is an intentional community, and that the layout of that facilitated it. Affordability was a really important factor. Self-governance was another important factor, and participatory design. And that is an amazing mix. And you can see why people, when they agree to these goals, they really stick to it. And the group worked really hard and did some pretty crazy, risky things to be able to make that project happen. But the way they made it happen was a mix of things, but there was definitely partners involved. So to be able to get to the affordable outcome, they worked with or created a community housing provider, which meant that people who were eligible for this type of subsidised housing could live in Murrindaka, but at a subsidised rate, and that's subsidised by government through a community housing provider. The other part of it was, which was extremely special and unique, was that community housing provider set up their dwellings under a cooperative title. And that allowed self-governance. So it meant that every person who lived there had one member, one vote, and they all have to look after the project themselves. So they have to collect the money, they have to manage the maintenance, and that's something that, you know, over time is a really big way for people to continue to work together as a community. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail because I want to do an overview of different general pathways, but I can at least talk to a general approach to partners. And it's super obvious, but sometimes you do have to actually sort of set it out as this is what we understand is the straightest line to getting a partner to say yes or no to funding all or a part of your project. So once you take your goals, you really have to research the policies that relate to, say, that government organisation or the policies of that private organisation. And you're looking for organisations who have policies that really relate to your particular co-housing group's goals. And you'll find that that's usually really easy to find, whether that's government or non-government organisations, and that's your hook. Once you've found them, you stalk the specific organisations. You want to find people, maybe even on LinkedIn, to say, they're the right person. You know, they're the, you know, the business development manager, or they're the ones who do the initial assessment. Once you find out who they are, it's best to approach them personally to say, okay, here's our project. We think your organisation aligns or wants to achieve these goals, and they align with our project. That's the strategic goal. So make sure you've looked at their goals and that your goals are written in a way that aligns with the same language as the strategic goals of that organisation. Even before you approach them personally, sometimes it's good to get advice. If you are wanting to talk to, say, a charitable organisation, it's good to talk to people that have talked to them before. Reach out to the Cohousing Australia network to say, have we ever had a co-housing project approach this type of organisation? And if so, how do I present it? You know, are they after presenting my project as a business case, say, like I've got on that last dot point, or maybe I present it in a way, so with social impact investors, they want to see it in a way called the theory of change. So that's a different way to present your project. So it's good to not only know the goals align with the organisation, but also that the way they want the information presented to them for consideration is the language that they use in their analysis of investment. So I'm going to go back to the other type, the do-it-ourselves model. So if the co-housing group's goals is to get really high levels of environmental building and system design, that we want a mixed generational community, or that we really want intentional neighbourhood design, which is the terminology around making sure that the way we move around the co-housing community makes us bump into each other, and that we have places to sit and spend time with each other, or we want to be self-governed. The do-it-ourselves pathways are more likely to get you those outcomes. The do-it-ourselves model would look at a different set of sources of finance. We have banks already involved in financing the development of co-housing projects. There's also a whole raft of money that sits in what we call private finance, and that's not well known amongst people outside the property development sphere. There are brokers for those sources of money, and they may cost a little bit more or less because they're smaller and more bespoke, but it does often reflect the riskiness of a project. We have this growing sector with money in it called the social impact investment sector. In Australia, it's maturing more and more month to month, and there are examples of how social impact investment has been a part of co-housing groups development in Australia already. There is also evidence of peer-to-peer lending, which has happened with a couple of co-housing groups as well, where one household can lend to another household for their share of the property development costs. And then the last one is crowdsourcing, something that I'm not sure has actually happened for a co-housing group in Australia, but definitely has happened overseas. So that's, I'm sure you've all heard about crowdsourcing in other arenas. So a case study of what I would call a do-it-ourselves model and their financial pathway is a beautiful project in Western Australia called Deco Housing, because it's a co-housing project that's in a town called Denmark, which is a pure coincidence that that's where there's a lot of co-housing projects. It's built and beautiful, 12 strata titled units, built to really high environmental standards using unusual materials. So they had building and open space sustainability as their goals. Again, pedestrian focus, car parks at the rear, intentional community. They really wanted a intergenerational mix. And that was one of their highest goals, self-governance and participatory design. So there wasn't anything here necessarily in their goals that pushed them to partner with an external organisation. So they went about self-financing, and it came with a little bit of money from SEFA, S-E-F-A, which is a smaller social impact investment firm. They were started by government, but they are a private entity. So with a mix of some funding from that social impact investment group with private money, so the actual finances and equity of the people who were going to live in the project, they were able to purchase the land and get the buildings built. And in the end, they all own them under separate mortgages under strata title. So amazing. They did it pretty quickly. And even though it still feels very slow, but it was a really good example of a do-it-ourselves model where they didn't have to partner with government or a community housing provider. So how to approach it, the do-it-ourselves finance sources. Again, clarify your project. And in this case, it's more than just clarifying your goals. You really have to do things like agree locations. You have to think of things like what kind of building type do we want? Do we want apartments or townhouses or separate houses? And then you have to work with the group of professional development professionals that work in property development to come up with what you call a project feasibility. So project feasibility is a term that's used in lots of different groups, but what talks to these types of lenders is that you are able to say that with all the actual costs it takes to purchase the land, pay for all the consultants to get the design and approvals sought, pay all your taxes, and then construct the building, then it will cost this much. And then that means that in the end, each of those homes will, each household will need to purchase those off the entity that created them, and that they can afford that. So the collective budget of the people who are going to buy at the end equals the costs that it would take to buy and develop that project. That is extremely important, and it needs to be created with quite a large group of consultants, everything from town planners, architects, quantity surveyors, and a development manager, to put that together in a very professional way to approach these types of lenders. That was all. So that's kind of what they look like. They're very long. There's lots of line items. You don't need to understand these intimately, but you have to know that you have to work with a set of consultants that can create that project feasibility. Who can you call on for help on this? We're not completely on our own. There is information and learnings from past projects. Always important to reach out to existing co-housing groups around the country. And it's great to look at overseas projects, but really the most important way to do it is to ask the ones in Australia, because we have different laws and our banks and lenders and organisations operate in different ways. Here is at least some of the existing communities who are more recent and who could talk to how they do it. And I have to say, each one of these is unique in the way that it was funded. And so there will be one amongst them that may be similar to your co-housing group's goals, and therefore can provide you with some fantastic lived experience advice around how they did it. And I'd have to say, unfortunately, that most of these people say, this is how we did it, but if I did it again, I probably wouldn't do it exactly the same. So they've all got really great advice to hand on. There's also communities in creation that have started their models, so they're also useful to talk to. And these are all projects that you can reach out to Cohousing Australia, and we can put you in contact with the right people. The specific professionals that I'm talking about that are really great for advice, whether you follow the do-it-ourselves model or the partnership model, they're things that co-housing groups often are a bit shy to speak to, but the more you ask, and it may feel like a dumb question at the time, but the more you ask, the more you learn, the more informed you are, because as a group, you are the ones creating this innovative model for yourselves. So you have to talk to relevant property development lawyers. You have to talk to accountants, because there's lots of tax involved in the process of property development. And there can be instances where you pay more tax than necessary, or than if you were doing a standard property development, and that can really knock out affordability. You need to talk to financial planners as a group as well, because all of this process will have an impact on your future and how you can afford things going forward. Town planners are really useful, because they can really start to give you the knowledge that you need so that you can, as a group, select suitable sites, because their zoning and all the other planning rules relate to that. There are, of course, architects, they're fun to speak to. Builders are really important to speak to too, especially if you're going to do something that's non-standard construction. And then there's a type of professional called a development manager. They're not as easy to find, but they are one of the most important professionals, especially in the do-it-ourselves model. And then there's the researchers who have done all this documentation around existing models. We've got people within Cohousing Australia and speaking today. They are also great sources of information to go to. There are existing professionals that exist and have done different versions of these models. We've got the property collectives people, Hip versus Height, Nightingale, Green Fabric, Civitas Solutions, which do cooperatives, the Henry Project. I say built for good, but now I'm no longer operating. But there are existing professionals as well to reach out to all of them and get their advice on how they could help you or not, or they point you in the right direction. But that's me. That's my very general overview of pathways to finance. But I'll stop here and see if there's any questions that I can answer.
We have a little bit of time up our sleeves, so this might be a great chance to... in fact, we've got quite a bit of time up our sleeves, because Karen, I think we had you booked to answer questions until around 12 o'clock. So I think this might be a bit of an opening in the program for not only questions, but perhaps people who wanted to allude to other projects that have not so far been mentioned to speak. Okay, we have one person coming up to the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, what do you plan to do when the government cuts the sustainable housing money in 2024? Sorry, I wish it was 1924.
I'm not across what you're specifically talking about, but I think that's why one of the reasons why co-housing groups form is from people who say, I want to live in a home that has less impact on climate change, so therefore I have to do something about it. And that's about bringing your knowledge and your will and your own money together with other people who have that shared goal. And that's how a co-housing group can create that. But it means that, I mean, in general, there's not many subsidies that exist for going to higher levels of energy efficiency. But there are some other mechanisms around that. I'm, again, no expert, but I know that there are mortgages that can be discounted if you use a higher energy rating on your building fabric. But I'm not sorry, I can't really answer that question around the subsidies being removed in 2024.
So my wife and I were investors, and we came along not knowing what this was all about. And I'm still looking to see how we might do something in co-housing.
Lovely. That's so great to hear.
Thank you.
Hi, Karen. You talked about in your first early slides, you talked about having participatory design and self-governance as an easier pathway through do-it-ourselves approaches rather than the partnership. But you also gave the example of Murrindaka having achieved those goals through a partnered design and setting up as a co-op. Do you think, or is that the best way to achieve those goals through partnership, by incorporating as a co-op, or are there other ways of achieving that?
Look, every one of these projects is unique, or every one that's been built in Australia. Murrindaka worked with a community housing provider, but it isn't the same as other community housing providers. There's one in each state. So Common Equity is the one in New South Wales, and there are equivalents around the country where they're community housing providers that only create their homes under the housing cooperative type of property title. So cooperative housing property title innately is amazing because it means that every resident, especially regardless of tenure, ownership or rental, is involved in the management of the property. So that's amazing. They were able to have an input into the design. Look, I don't know exactly the details, but the land was owned by one of the members. So that had an effect on how that whole project was run. If you were a co-housing group that approached a community housing provider because you were after affordable rentals in your project, it's not a guaranteed way to be involved in the design. It is a definite way to get affordable rental. But that's why I put the participatory design in the do-it-ourselves model. So in the Deco Housing example, they were the ones who bought the land. They were the ones that engaged the architect, the town planner, the landscape architect. So they were fully in control of the design. So that's why they were able to get, they were able to involve hempcrete in all the walls, which is an unusual construction type, which is something that I would say a community housing provider may not look at because of its unusualness. It will continue to own that property, so it's looking to have properties that it is really sure it can maintain into the future. So I know that it's not that every project and not every goal has to fit in one of those two categories, But from what we've observed of existing projects, if it's really important to a group to be involved in the design and to work really closely with the architects, the do-it-ourselves model definitely provides that. But you may be able to achieve that if you partnered with a government entity or a community housing provider.
Thanks, Karen. This is Chris. I've got a question from the chat, from the streaming, from Tonya Gibson. She says, "Hi, Karen. What's the skill set of a development manager?"
Oh, Tonya, good question. So a development manager actually is a profession. They study it at uni. They are the professionals that run property development projects. So their skills range everything from managing and understanding the risks of a property development process. So every contractor you engage, from all the consultants, so all, the architect, town planner, the engineer, the civil engineer, they know who to contract, who's a relevant type of consultant for the project. And then they manage them as a group. The other part that they do is they engage and or tender the construction company. So they make sure that they, or the contracts that go out to those, that really big cost is really watertight, that the budgets are met, that the budget is somehow contracted as well. So in essence, they are fully responsible for the property development process. So any property development project that you see that is built by property developers have within their employment development managers. They're the ones that they would employ to create apartment buildings or a townhouse development, or even something like the Cape, which is a range of houses on their own block of land. They are told, this is the outcome we need. We need 22 apartments that have this kind of market value at the end. And then they are the professionals that run that entire project from the beginning all the way to finished.
Thanks very much, Karen. My name is Tony. Building on that last question, presumably if you really want to do messy co-housing and learn from the process, you could bypass the development manager and aim to build the assets that you see in your own group. But my particular questions, there are two. One, just from your experience, how much time should you commit? What's the sort of time frame? What's useful to think of in terms of that preparatory stuff? And the cost of that preparatory or pre-planning before you move in, just to give myself a sort of heads up on what to imagine, the horizon, how long. And related, any tips on location? So how to choose the place to establish a co-housing community? Anything helpful that may help a group kind of decide or where to land, as it were?
Yeah, good questions. How long and how much would it cost to prepare? I'm guessing to get to the point from being an idea to moving in. Look, Jasmine's just behind you, but it's something around 10 years, I think, is the going rate for projects. And that really mainly, even watching the urban coop process, which I think was about 11, 12 years, it spent 3 years engaging with a community housing provider, which fell through, so we lost 3 years thinking that we had the property development partner ready, with the finance ready, and for various reasons it fell through. So 3 years out of those 11, 12 years was lost, I think, because for various reasons. Maybe they weren't the right partner, maybe we weren't clear enough as a group that they were going to give us the outcome that the coop the Coop wanted. Newco is in its 6th year, but a part of its goals was to get it done fairly quickly, because most of the co-founders are retired and they just really need to just get in. And that goal actually set our pathway, which is not a pathway that I showed today, which is we partnered with a property developer, where we basically came to them and said, we're like a buyers group. We're 28 households. We want this many 1-bedder, 2-bedders and 3-bedders. If you let us have some customization of the design, we will buy them all. And that way we've de-risked your project. And that way you've got professionals who know what they're doing it and doing it quickly. So that's the way we've got it faster. So again, it's always about the co-housing group's goals that drives what kind of model you go for. In terms of cost, which was a really important one, so not huge money, but I suppose, but it depends on what model you use. So Newco collectively in the last 6 years in our costs for consultants has mainly been legal costs. And our budget, I think you would say in total for the last 6 years has collectively been about $15,000. But we're going for an unusual type of property title. We're doing a strata title embedded in a community title, so that we can have our goal, which is property, so like all people, regardless being a renter or an owner, can property manage. And so that legal advice gave us the knowledge to then talk to a property developer to say, we want all this, but we also want this kind of property title combination. And that's why it was so important to talk to a lawyer. We were able to get that advice. The other part to your question was, what's a good location? That's a really hard one. That's really to do with what the group wants. You know, you really have to sit down and have a visioning exercise together to say, you know, what are we thinking here? Are we thinking like living in a really high amenity area with lots of things close by, so therefore you're probably going to go for either apartments or townhouses? Or do you want a really beautiful location with lots of nature around you and sort of separate houses? Those are things that you have to answer for yourself. I always think of it, co-housing, or I describe it to people as creating a house with like 29 husbands. And it's that kind of process where you've got to get everyone sort of to the same level of knowledge, but also all make a decision together where no one's going to divorce you if you buy that block of land.
That's really hard to follow, Karen.
Go, Jasmine.
It's Jasmine here. I wonder if you might spend a moment. I joined the queue for questions when we had the question earlier about participatory design. And the degree of which that can be achieved through different types of partnerships. And you've touched on sort of where I'm heading a little bit in the meantime. But I wonder if you might speak to the outcomes of who carries risk in development. So there's different types of partnerships that you're talking about, doing it ourselves or partnering with other organisations. You know, we know that the people who make decisions are those who hold the money. That's, you know, no matter how much we research, that's what we come out with ultimately. So I wonder if you might speak to that notion of the capacity to achieve your goals linked to the partnership types and the carrying of risk.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, Jasmine. I feel like that's a whole other webinar and really essential piece of knowledge. The do-it-ourselves model and that Deco housing project, you could basically say they had full control over the design and the site selection, you know, right back to where it was going to be. But what, like Jasmine is saying, because of the do-it-ourselves model, where they actually purchased that block of land with a small number of the members of the co-housing group, And then together they took on the risk of the finance for the construction with some help from the social impact investor, CEFA. They bore the risk. They became property developers. It meant that if anything went wrong during that development and construction period, they are liable, and we're talking big zeros here. So with more control, generally, as Jasmine's saying, is more risk. And it's one of the things that sort of tempers the goal of co-housing groups. We might want full participatory design, but in essence, we haven't worked out a method yet where we can get full control with minimal risk. There are models like the Nightingale model, like Newco, where you have some level of customization, you would call it. You wouldn't say full control over all the design decisions, but for less risk. So there's a sliding scale of full control, lots of risk, or all risk, less control, less risk, right down to zero risk, but probably very, very little control over the design. Hope that answers it.
In a whiteboard, people, and you can write questions up
Chris.
if we run out of question time, because we have a swift kind of program happening. So Fiona, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you so much for bringing that practical dimension to today's menu. What you've given us is also extremely valuable, and again, I imagine we'll be able to get a copy of your slides for people to gaze at down the path. And our next speaker actually is going to tie in really nicely with what you were talking about. Our next speaker actually is a managing director of a property group, a Canberra-based business who specialises in property development and property management and investment. And so this, I don't know, are you able to stick around and hear this next speaker, Karen? I don't know how that would work. Perhaps not.